Today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic, the topic of greed. Greed. How do we overcome our tendency to want money or material things too greatly? How do we overcome that? Well, there's two words I want to plant in your mind from the very beginning: detachment and generosity. John D. Rockefeller, one of the richest individuals in American history, was once asked by a reporter, "Mr. Rockefeller, how much money do you need?" And he responded, "Just a little bit more." So some of the issues we're going to be talking about today have to do with just a little bit more. I think I'll be safe if I have just a little bit more tucked in the bank. I don't know about you, but occasionally I'll look at my cell phone just to check up on the numbers in my cell phone that I sometimes look to for my sense of security. I'm moving into my eighth decade. I'm 2 years into my eighth decade. And it's really surprising what happens when you get a little bit older. You begin to ask questions like this: who's going to take care of me if I get sick? Do I have enough money to pay the mortgage? Prices are going up in the United States at this time. Inflation rates are quite high. Am I going to be able to fill up my gas tank? These eighth decade questions were questions the desert dwellers asked as they got older. Is my community going to be able to take care of me? Am I safe? Do I need to tuck away a little bit more? Now, the desert dwellers had very few possessions, and especially when they were younger, that wasn't much of a problem because you're always thinking, well, I might just have to head back into Alexandria. But the older they got, they realized, I've chosen a way of life that's a very simple way of life. I have very few possessions, and they would begin to ask questions like I'm beginning to ask. So these are important things to think through. Issues about greed being loving, I'm going to use this word carefully, loving material possessions, loving money too much. The more I can love what is genuinely worth loving, the less will be the temptation to love something like possessions or money too deeply. And the word that the desert dwellers would use is detachment. So we could all ask this question together: to what have I become too deeply attached? But for example, something that you possess that you would not give away. Now, I'm not going to give away my wedding ring, because this wedding ring symbolizes my life with my wife. That's going to stay in my finger. I'm not going to give away this watch. Why? Just because it's a fancy watch? Well, it's not a real terribly fancy watch, but it's a watch my dad gave me as his death drew near. So there's some things we wouldn't consider giving away or becoming detached from. But there are other things we can get really too deeply attached to, which means they have a place in our mind and our heart that goes beyond what makes sense. There's a certain irrationality to greed. If we're holding on to something too tightly, and a possession, a jacket, a baseball hat, I like baseball, has taken on a meaning in our life that's exaggerated, overblown, and the Lord might ask us to become less attached to it. Detachment. Here's another good word that I mentioned a bit earlier: generosity. Jesus' teaching comes to mind. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Now, there's a church father, a desert dweller, who can help us at this point. He's a very interesting man, a bit of a grizzly bear, but a generous grizzly bear is what I would call him. He's recognized with the name Basil the Great. Basil the Great. He grew up in Cappadocia, kind of a rocky area of southern Turkey, and he grew up in a wealthy family. He had enough money in the family where they could send him off to study in Athens. He became well educated in Athens, studied all the Greek and Latin classics. And when he got home, he was a little bit too full of himself. He was proud. He was very gifted, and he let other people know he was gifted. And his sister said to him, Basil, I think you need to spend some time in the desert. So he headed off into the desert, spent time in the desert where no one was recognizing him out there. Pretty much nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew how well educated he was. And by taking his body and mind into the desert, he saw things and heard things, probably interacted with Egyptian peasants and so on. And his perspective on his own gifting moved from a kind of greediness and parading of what he had been given by God to a much healthier perspective. One of detachment, and surprisingly for Basil, one of generosity. When Basil headed home, he started to found hospitals and orphanages. His heart had changed. So I want to recommend to you, if you've never read Basil before, start reading him in an accessible translation. And when he speaks up about the poor, he really turns the volume up and basically says, if you see someone who's poor or in need and you do nothing to help alleviate that situation, you're sinning against that person. Let's head back into the living room, grab a seat, grab a cup of coffee. Now we're talking amongst one another. Questions are coming up like, well, how much is too much? How can I tell if I'm loving what I possess too much? Is it foolish to give away everything I possess? Some of the desert dwellers did. Jesus is fairly radical on some of these points. What might Basil say to us? Here's a surprising spiritual discipline he might have suggested to us as he's sitting with us in the living room. It's the spiritual discipline of proximity. I have a very good friend. He's like my younger brother. His name is Shane Claiborne. Shane Claiborne. And Shane works a lot with poor folks and feels very strongly about issues of poverty, wealth, social justice, and so on. And Shane moved down to one of the roughest streets in North Philadelphia, Potter Street. It is a rough place to live. And here's their professor saying, Shane, are you sure you want to do that? It's dangerous down there. Lots of drug dealing, gunfire, and so on. He felt led to go down there, and he's lived down there, I think, for over 19 years now. Think now to this discipline, as Basil might express it, the discipline of proximity. I knew what God was saying to me is, Chris, you have to follow the example of your students. So I would take literally my body, get in my car, and drive down to Potter Street. And only by going to Potter Street did I see what I needed to see, hear what I needed to hear. The discipline of proximity. Let me give you a quote from Basil. He said, quote, to see and to fail to respond to human need is a serious problem. So we've been talking about the seeing aspect of that. What is the Lord asking you to see that you're not seeing? Poor folks oftentimes feel like they're invisible. Nobody's seeing me. This is God's precious image bearer, as valuable as me. He says to fail to see. So I want to encourage you. I can hear him saying to our living room group, go to where you see what you need to see. And we say, well, it's dangerous down there. Yes. Why should that be a surprise? The Lord asks us to go into dangerous places and to help folks there. I want you to see what you need to see and then respond as God guides you to respond. And in such a way, Basil would say, we'll be overcoming the temptation we all have to think that we're safe if we have more cash in the bank. Sometimes, every once in a while, we just have to go back to some basic principles. And one of them has to do with how we're treating money, how we're treating possessions, and how we're treating the poor. For the desert dwellers at the top of the list of the people that they wanted us to see were the widows and the orphans, the poor, and those who could not protect themselves. Hence Basil's emphasis on seeing and on being willing to go to places we would rather not go. The first few times I went down to Potter Street, I have to admit I was a bit nervous. I've been with Shane, and he would walk up to a drug lord and scold the drug lord. We made a deal. You're not supposed to be selling on this corner. And the drug lord would kind of smile. But he admired the courage in Shane, and he'd move off. If we do possess a measure of material wealth, Basil would encourage us, and Jesus behind Basil, to ask, why have I been given what I've been given? It's all gift. It's all gift. My ability to write, for example, my ability to be able to speak, that's a gift. It's a gift. Why have I been given a gift that has enabled me to lead a very comfortable lifestyle compared to the vast majority of people in the world today? Why? That's the question to ask. Is there somebody in my neighborhood who could use my help? Is there somebody in my town who could use my help? Perhaps somebody in my church that I've become aware of who could use my help. And then we move out into the broader areas of human life that we're encountering, where we might be able just to do something small. Doesn't have to be a big deal. Something small. See, the goal would be to learn to live in a moderate way so that we have more to give away to others. The antonym for moderation would be extravagance. Let's just compare the two words. I love cars. I love cars. Have from a kid. And so occasionally I say, hon, I really think having a red Corvette would be great. A red Corvette. And she would respond, you don't need that. And I'd say, hon, you don't understand. I really do need a red Corvette. No, hon, you don't need that. You're old, and if you drove it, you would kill yourself. So I said, yeah, you're right. I bought a red Honda Accord. And there's a big difference between a red Corvette and a red Honda Accord. That was a more moderate way of enjoying a car that really is a good car. Developing moderation in our modern situation would help Christian folk as they try to reach out to other folks who are not quite sure that God even exists. Imagine a situation where someone's on TV preaching the gospel, preaching what Jesus had to say about a simple lifestyle, for instance. And then when the sermon's over, the cameras turn off, he or she climb into their private jet to fly off to the next location. I think there's something amiss in that. The onlooking world has every right to say at that point, I'm not sure that person really believes what they're talking about. So as we're dealing with greed, we want to focus on the things that really matter. A final word. When I first started teaching at the university where I taught in the Philadelphia area, we were not making a lot of money. And my kids were young. And we were able to buy the first house. It was a townhouse that we'd ever possessed. We were so excited. And it had a backyard the size of a postage stamp. One of my sons said, Dad, we need a pool. We need a pool. And I said, nay. I said, son, we don't have room for a pool. It's a little postage stamp backyard. No, Dad, we really need a pool. If we had a pool, we could swim in here every day. We'd have it all to ourselves. That was a key line. We'd have it all to ourselves. Well, we had a running debate about this for a while. And then we discovered that at the university provided faculty with access to the university pool, which was much larger than a postage stamp. Lots of families gathering there. You could have picnics there, a big diving board, fun galore. We did not have to own the university pool to enjoy it. And a few months in, the son in question said, Dad, I think you were right. It's a lot of fun coming here. I've made new friends. It's a big pool. Dad, I think you were right on that one. Become a more generous person, holding what we possess lightly, with the result being freedom. Freedom. See you soon. God bless.